record this. So the overview of, and I'm going to call it supply decisions, because I think one of the things that confuses students sometimes is that, technically speaking, the supply function only works for competitive industries. So we have to talk more about what type of industry you're in, the business exists in, the firm exists in order to understand its supply decisions. And we talked about this a little bit before, but basically it has to do with this revenue opportunity component of profit maximization. So all firms maximize profits, but if the firm exists in a imperfectly competitive environment, then it has some control over its revenue, which shows up basically as a marginal revenue function. I say basically because it does get a little bit more complicated than that when we talk about oligopoly. But so for the supply decisions, you have to remember this, okay? So for the firm in competition, and I would say, this is the sort of thing that you could put on a flashcard or print out, or set next to you as you go through solving the problems. Because if you kind of like don't get it, then you'll be wondering, okay, what formula, what technique should I apply in this case? And you have to kind of go down through the list. So for a firm in competition, we know that supply equals the marginal cost function of the firm. And I should say, approximately, because we also have the shutdown rules and the difference between the short run and the long run. But in both the short and the long run, the marginal cost function defines the supply decisions of the competitive firm. But it's only the segment of the marginal cost function that's above the minimum of the average variable cost curve. At any time you drift below the minimum of the average variable costs, in the short run or the long run, you stop producing. In the long run, it would mean that you would exit the industry. Long run decisions to shut down are permanent. So that's the difference between shutting down and exiting. Shutting down is a temporary decision to produce zero, wait for market conditions to improve. But exiting is permanently getting out of the industry. But for the industry / market supply, we have this new concept of the joint marginal cost. And again, it's one of those things that's approximate, and that's what we're going to spend really the remaining part of the class talking about. Is so Derek, are you there for a minute? I want to kind of chat with somebody.
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. So do you remember that when you've got multiple firms in an industry or multiple firms in a market, and they're all going to supply some amount to the market, that we add up those, we call it the horizontal sum of the individual supply curves to get the market supply curve. And do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So and technically, I don't know if you ever thought about this. It's fine if you haven't, but it's a really easy concept, because you just say, oh, at this price, firm 1 would supply 10 units. And at the same price, firm 2 would supply 12 units. So then you just add those units together, and at whatever price that was, and you would have 10 plus 12 is 22 units are supplied to the market. And you just go up the prices and you just add up what each of the firms will supply, which is, you know, I don't know about you, Derek. Do you think that's easy? I think that's easy.
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Yeah, you just, you know, it's what you would do just intuitively. But here's the rub. And here's the difficult part, right? Is that doing that mathematically is tricky. Mathematically, what I mean is adding up individual supply functions to get a market supply function is actually a little bit tricky. And if you spend any time, which you're going to in this class, like trying to do it, you'd realize it was tricky. So this is like a key that we need to go forward. And I'm gonna, the lectures that I gave you guys teach you how to mathematically derive the joint marginal cost function. And like I said, there's some subtlety involved. But we're gonna do that, because what that enables us to do is then look at these other cases and compare them and come up with actual answers, meaning numerical solutions to these models. So for monopoly, there is no supply curve. Rather, the monopolist has a marginal cost, but the marginal cost is combined with the marginal revenue. And I say equals, which maybe I should just put equals because it's not a definition, in order to determine supply, right? And we no longer have this issue of differentiating between the joint, which means the combining of the marginal cost function, where we join them together, because the monopolist has the whole market. So maybe I'll talk to somebody else. Joseph, are you there this morning? I see you in the. Oh,
yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, how are you doing?
I'm all right.
All right, me too. So it's getting towards the end of this semester, so
yeah,
getting revved up, and I look forward to the end. You know, it's an accomplishment, like done. But I don't know if you've ever thought about monopoly, but you know, a lot of people tend to think, can you name a monopolist? Or maybe we've talked a little bit about it, or something that looks like a monopoly to you in the real world.
Doesn't AT&T kind of have a weird monopoly because all the other companies rent their stuff?
Well, yeah. So actually, I think there is some kind of truth to that. I would have to look up the details myself. You know, originally there was one national telephone company, Bell Telephone Company, and then back when I was a kid in the 1980s, the federal government, in order to create more competition, broke it up And then we ended up with Sprint and AT&T, and then they have like regional um, um, Bell telephone carriers, like, you know, Bell Telephone South, and, you know, various other ones, and Verizon is also a child of that former monopoly, the Bell Telephone monopoly. But yeah, so I think that that's an okay example. I mean, obviously it's not one firm, but the point's well taken. It's difficult to think of examples of monopoly these days. There are a few. The most common one would be like a utility. So if you think of the gas company, and they're normally confined to certain regions, like we have Southern California Edison, so it's a monopoly for electricity in our region. And but I guess the real point that I wanted to make is that most people that think of monopolies have this idea that the monopolist is a big company, whatever that means. And so they think there's one, and they have the whole market for serving customers. And so they must be this big, giant company. And that's not really the way that monopolies look in the real world. So I would say, you know, and you could go back and you could look at classic examples. Before they call them antitrust laws were passed in the United States. Antitrust laws were these legal rules that were passed in the beginning of the 20th century to break up big industrial monopolies. So like US Steel used to be a steel company that owned all of the steel production in the United States, and Standard Oil was a oil monopoly. And to break those up, to create a more competitive oil and steel industry. But you know, it's one thing to say that a company has a big presence in, and I can't really keep my idea on so Diego, since you were in the chat, if you have a comment or you see somebody else or a question, because I can't keep an eye on everything, then go ahead and let me know. Okay, do you have your mic this morning, Diego?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, so you can be our chat monitor, okay?
Got it.
Yeah, so if there's something that comes up, okay? So yeah, I like your examples too. And the point is to serve a lot of customers. Think about a company like Starbucks, right? You wouldn't really think that Starbucks is a monopolist, even though they might be a dominant firm, is what we would call them in, you know, the coffee shop industry. But if you look at Starbucks, right, there might be an office tower someplace in downtown Seattle, because that's where Starbucks is originally from, is from Washington. But any given Starbucks location is this just, it doesn't really look, if you look at, you know, Coffee Bean and Tea, or if you look at the other coffee shops that they compete with, they're basically like the same size, about the same amount of seating capacity, you know, and the same amount of drive-through capacity. Some of them are a little bit bigger, but that's what a monopolist in the real world looks like. They have this capacity to serve a lot of customers. But if, for example, suddenly we passed a law that said all those individual Starbucks had to be run separately, you know, they couldn't be one company anymore, then on the production side, they would look a lot like little small coffee shops. So, and the really important point for us is that the joint marginal cost function for all those individual little coffee shops would be the marginal cost for the monopolist. And that's really the point that I wanted to make is a lot of students, I think, get confused when they say, oh, we're talking about the market supply curve. I understand that's a joint marginal cost for all these individual firms in the competitive industry. But now, to compare it to monopoly, we're saying the monopolist has the same cost structure as a competitive industry of a bunch of these little production units. And now it's this big company. Shouldn't their costs be different? And the answer is, well, no, not necessarily. Now, I'm not saying there's not some argument that on some level, coordinating production across a bunch of different little coffee shops might, give some special ability to control costs in a way that the individual little independent coffee shops can't. But again, not necessarily. And remember that all firms at all times, because they're trying to maximize their profits, have an incentive to lower their costs to the absolute minimum. So yeah, we're going to actually use the joint marginal cost function as the marginal cost for the monopolists when we compare the two, and that's the main point. So I see these things coming up in chat. Is there anything important, Diego, or can I just move on?
No, the only thing is Sonico is asking about a monopoly in Amazon. Now, I don't know if you have an economic an economic kind of term for what Amazon is, in terms of like if they're a monopoly or not. I don't know if you want to chime in on that though.
Yeah, again, we would tend to, and we talked maybe a little bit about this before. I think I might have mentioned it, but Amazon and Walmart have, remember, monopoly power is the ability to influence the price. The big difference is that if you're a competitive firm, you're just a price taker. So obviously, and instead of calling it monopoly power, you could call it pricing power. That's okay. Some people do. But for the purposes of this course, we'll think of pricing power as being monopoly power. But the point is that yeah, you could argue that Amazon in online retail and Walmart, in real life retail, have this pricing power that other firms don't. But the other thing too is that a true monopolist, has pricing power at its strongest, and that's really the difference. A competitive firm has no pricing power; they just have to accept the market price. They're too small on the demand side, meaning like the number of customers they serve on the market share side. They're too small to influence the price at all. And then at the peak of pricing power, you have the true monopoly, the company that owns the patent on the life-saving medication, and they can, price. Now, again, as we learned for the monopolists, if they're trying to maximize their profits, they can't price beyond the ability of consumers to pay, right? Because they just won't sell anything. So they have a limit or a check on their pricing power too. But other firms, and we'll talk about this, there are really 4 models of oligopoly or imperfect competition that we want to talk about. And we talk about monopolist competition just a little bit, but on that spectrum of no pricing power to greatest possible pricing power, they lie somewhere in between. So yeah, we would probably call Amazon or Walmart a dominant firm within an industry, and those dominant firms do have pricing power, just not as much as a true monopolist. So
yeah, and if I could just interject real quick, like I was gonna type this in the chat, but like moreover, the reason I was thinking that Amazon is slowly turning into monopoly is because one of their main strategies is to look at the statistics of products being like
yeah, and
bought
then
through
copy the
them.
ones that that are
Yeah, and then
successful.
picking the ones, going like cutting them out, going straight to the manufacturer and then selling them for a little cheaper, just so they could get those, like they could basically cut them out. And then also the whole fact that they're going into different industries like Amazon Fresh, like with Walmart. Walmart is like somewhat of a grocery store. And so
Yeah.
because of that, like stuff like that. So that's why I was thinking it on that hand, like, is it slowly turning into a monopoly? But yeah.
Well, again,
See, the
what
big like, because I work with Amazon. I've been employed
Sure.
for 3 years, and a lot of their internal strategy with their delivery, they're actually willing to sell stuff at a loss in order to try to kind of turn the market, get themselves out there, be known as the ones that sell it on the cheap. However,
Yeah.
I like the whole thing is the idea that you can kind of sell at a loss and you kind of figure that it's worth it with like razor thin profit margins. I think that's kind of what I wanted to mention. Like, would that be kind of a monopolistic trait? Like, you can sell things at a loss temporarily in order to curve the market down later on in the future.
Yeah, so there are all of these, and I just wanted to mention, and this is kind of a really good segue. So once we're starting to talk about firms that have pricing power, we're starting to talk about the sort of models that capture this stuff, and really they fall under imperfect competition and primarily oligopoly. That's where you have a few firms, but you might also have this dominant firm with competitive fringe, which competitive fringe could have a lot of small firms and like one or maybe two big firms, some dominant firms in the industry. So once you get into oligopoly, things get more realistic and more complicated to understand. But so this really is the beginning of our outline of the way that things work, because everything that you guys are talking about has been modeled by economists, and Amazon's not the first. The really what you guys are talking about is the idea that, like Diego's saying, they can sell for a loss for a little while, but that's only if eventually that's going to help them become more profitable, because they're going to gain some sort of dominant position in pricing power, like be able to like make up for the losses. And obviously, yeah, because like no firm, no matter how big, can sell at a loss indefinitely. They'll go bankrupt, right? So it's a bad strategy to try to do that permanently. But the issue you're talking about is what we would call an entry threat issue. An entry, remember, is somebody coming into the market, and exiting is going out of the market on a permanent basis, right? It's a long run decision to start up a new business or to close down one with no intention of operating it anymore. That's exiting. So what you find out in those types of situations is that monopolists that engage in these, they call them predatory pricing strategies, where they try to gain a big market share by selling at a loss and forcing the competition out. Well, and then once they force the competitors out of the market, and then they can raise their price like a monopolist. But remember, when they raise their price, then unless there's some barrier to entry, then other firms will just come back into the market. So they would be stuck down at this really, just call it a low, like competitive price, the one that's just a penny above or a penny below where other firms could enter the market. And so those other firms that might think about, oh, okay, now, we're going to watch Amazon. And if they raise the price of socks or something like that, then we're going to come in. Well, if Amazon knows they're going to do that, then they'll just keep the price low. And remember, those are all business pricing strategy issues. And I want to differentiate between that and the economic issue, because the economic issue is really about inefficiency. And inefficiency is about welfare loss, the loss of consumer and producer surplus, the presence of deadweight loss, right? Deadweight loss is the loss, we talked about this early on in the semester, right? The loss of total surplus because you're underproducing or overproducing what the competitive market would provide. And so it turns out that if a monopolist, because of this entry threat, is forced to behave in the same way with respect to its supply decisions as a competitive industry, then there is no economic issue. That's fine. It's a business issue, but economists don't dislike, and I put it in quotes because it's a scientific discipline, right? But we don't have any criticism or comment about firms dominating an industry as long as they don't jack up the price, and we don't mind, again, that would make them be more profitable, because remember, profit counts as producer surplus. That's a good thing. But if they cause a loss of consumer surplus that's greater than the profits they gain by jacking up the price, then they've created inefficiency. And so what you guys are kind of talking about is this sort of, special model of the way it's been modeled in the past is you have a dominant firm with this entry threat, and so they have to keep the prices low, or they're going to be back in the same situation they were before, where they raise the price and they have more competition and they're no longer dominating the industry. So I would recommend, we're just starting this, and we're going to outline a few approaches to these types of questions. But this is actually a whole course called Industrial Organization, and Dr. Kerr teaches it, and I would recommend that you all take it. It's a really good class where they can talk about these models in more detail and their result. But the two that I have on my list under oligopoly, and we're going to study really simple cases of oligopoly just because we want to keep the math as simple as possible, so we can understand our conclusions and work through problems. But they extend to a greater number of firms. But what a lot of people kind of forget is there's really two ways that firms can compete with one another. And the outcome of the models in terms of pricing and output and efficiency are vastly different, and it's really, really surprising. But based on the thing that we just talked about of a monopolist with an entry threat behaving like a competitive industry, really kind of highlights what these models say and how wildly different they are. So one way that firms can compete is through quantity. So the Cornell model is a quantity setting model. And I would tell you that this type of model is good for what I would call long maybe that's not the best use of language, but slow production cycles. Okay, and what I mean by slow production cycles, and here, you know, fast and slow don't have any real meaning. It's just relative to one another. It's a way of thinking about it. But when you're talking about things like agricultural products, right? Nature, you know, genetic engineering and the rest of it, maybe someday, but you can't grow an orange in a day, right? It takes a whole season to grow oranges. So what that means is that at the beginning of that production cycle, you have to plan for how much output you want to have at the end. And you don't know what the price is going to be. So you're stuck in the end with whatever amount of output you get, and then you have to sell it at the best price that you can get at that point in time, at the end of the production cycle. There are other things where the production cycles have a lot more control. The firms can, for example, you know, ramp up production or reduce production relatively quickly. So maybe, you know, you're making t-shirts, and, you know, how long does it take to make a t-shirt? I don't know. I mean, if you go from, you know, the time that you cut the cloth and sew it, if you don't have to make the cloth yourself, right? Then you can probably, and I had a student a couple of semesters ago that he actually was an online retailer of t-shirts where he printed artwork on the t-shirts, you know, so he just gets the t-shirt blanks and he puts the artwork on them. But the point is that even if you're like sewing a t-shirt, you could probably, you know, get one t-shirt pretty quickly. And if you need more t-shirts, then you can get more of them. You might have a capacity, but there's a lot more ability to control what's going to be produced in a relatively short period of time. So in that kind of environment, it tends to be that this Bertrand model, and these are just names of economists that came up with these ideas in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And it's a price setting model. So I would say these, you know, relatively fast production cycles, goods. So these models sort of like well describe, and these either slow production cycle, what you would call like industrial production, versus more, you know, retail level stuff. Because what you see with Amazon, and remember, the only thing that Amazon really produces is retail services. So they might go in and when Sonica was saying, oh, they find a popular product and then they copy it. You know, Sonica, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Do you think that Amazon has like an Amazon factory and they produce it themselves?
It was moreover that I like, and this is where I'm thinking it might not be monopoly as well. I'm not sure too much about the facts, but like it was basically this documentary that I watched a while back. Like basically my like another econ teacher had to show it to us and was like, here's an example of like some stuff that happens under the table and stuff. Well, not under the table, but basically what they do is that they look at the statistics of different products and they're like, oh, this is doing pretty well.
So who was it? Somebody at Cal Poly?
No, it was like it was one of my teachers. Like I took some community college courses online during the summer in between. So like it was like one of those, like I don't even think it was econ. I think it was like an accounting class.
Yeah,
so like, here,
that's fine.
Interested.
But the only point I wanted to make is that I don't believe, I could be wrong, but I don't believe that Amazon has the production capacity for all of these different products that may or may not be popular. I think what they do
Yeah, so
is
what I was
is that
going to
they'll
say,
they'll tell another firm that they want them to produce this thing, and then they'll license it as an Amazon product. You know what I
so
mean?
what I was gonna say is that essentially what they do is that they will take it, they'll go straight to the manufacturer that manufactures these
Right.
products for that specific business or company that's working through them.
Yeah.
They'll buy more in bulk, essentially, and and then pretty much pay, like make it go like have it at cheaper price and just start like putting on everyone's feed that would buy those specific products and be like,
Right.
hey, like we have something that's similar to this product. And like that's how Amazon Basics has come to view as well, right? Because
Right. Okay. So
yeah,
you made my point for me. It's not Amazon actually producing the thing. They're just setting up this retail part of it.
yeah, they
Either
can't
licensing
produce
the product.
that many
Yeah.
things, but like
Yeah. So the point that I wanted to make is that from my understanding of the real like world of what Amazon and Walmart do, is they're just retailers. That's what they specialize in. They make a little bit of a margin on their retail services. And so it's really important to kind of differentiate between the idea that Amazon is actually producing all this stuff and is a monopolist in the production side of it, versus what Amazon really does is they dominate in this very narrow category, which is getting the good out the door to the consumer. That's the retail part, and that's where they make their money. But I don't want to get down into the weeds. My point was that 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 price setting is really common in these retail environments where it's that, last little bit of getting the product out the door to the customer. So a Bertrand model, a price setting model where you've got intense price competition. A lot of times when you look at, gas stations, you'll see that, pennies separate the price, and one lowers it, the other one lowers it. That's kind of what the Bertrand model is about. And I also want to point out here that we're going to spend a lot more time talking about the Cournot. And I should say, I'll put another little hyphen in here because it'll let you all know the Cournot Nash from the Nash equilibrium, which you all, if you're not familiar with at this point, will be shortly. We're going to spend a lot more time on the Nash Cournot or Cournot Nash quantity setting model, and so I'll ask you. So Sonika, can you think of why we would spend more time on that based on the descriptions that I've given you?
I'm still kind of confused. Like, what do you mean like spend more time on slow production circles like Nash or
Cycles? Yeah.
I guess like if you wanted it like the way that I see it in terms of slow production circles is that if you are
Cycles.
cycles, if you are spending more time on a product or a few products, you're ensuring that the quality is good, that there's no problems in it. That's where I'm
Okay,
thinking manufacturing side.
okay, so let me get you on board. Okay, remember how I said like oranges,
Mm-hmm.
right? So from a societal point of view, what's more important? Agricultural products, getting food to your population, or finding out if we have enough resources going to Hello Kitty hairbands.
It's probably the first one.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, when I talk about industrial production, food, medicine, I say chemicals, and chemicals I include oil, gas, all that stuff. Well, those things are things you can't produce overnight, right?
Yeah.
And they're really essential to have a good amount of that stuff in society, because really, what's the downside? I mean, you know, if you have lots of timber and lots of steel and lots of agricultural products, let's just call it at the wholesale level available, right? Then what's the real risk to your population if you do have monopoly in retail, right? Well, it's not that big, to be honest, right? Because at the end of the day, the milk, eggs, cheese, and, you know, building materials to make houses and stuff like that's going to be abundant. And, you know, there's not going to be a lot of opportunity, right, for retailers to be like, no, we have all this stuff and we're not going to let anybody, you know, turn the wood into furniture or some weird thing, right? Because other people could just get in there and do it instead. And, you know, anyway, I think from a social point of view, the bigger place where you want to really, because remember, at the end of the day, we get into these kind of, you know, is Walmart, is Amazon, are they monopolists? And, you know, we spend a lot of time on it. But the only reason why we do that is because we're sitting at home and we've got lots of snacks in the refrigerator and we can think about this stuff, right? It's not, we're not talking about the stuff that's most essential because that's abundant the way that our system is set up. And that's where I think the most concern is when we're talking about resource allocation in society. You know, economists a long time ago got concerned about, are we going to have enough of those industrial products that really society is built on? And because they have these slow production cycles, then we become concerned that when there's a business that's dominating them, and I'm going to metaphorically, you know, charging a price premium, jacking up the price, that the result is that there's not going to be enough food distributed, right? There's not going to be enough, and you probably don't think about it, but like things like steel are literally, you know, everywhere. You know, every bridge you go underneath it has some steel, you know, rebar in it. And, you know, when I used to be teaching, you know, in the classes at Cal Poly, I would tell the students to look down at their desks and all that, you know, steel tubing there. It's, you know, in your car, or, you know, industrial metals like aluminum and stuff like that. So I guess the thing is that this stuff we spend a lot more time on because we're dealing with those resources that seem more important from a social level. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this stuff is interesting too, but we won't spend as much time on that. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out is that we have these kind of the one that we're going to talk about is the Stackelberg, and this is just one extension. It's an extension of Nash, or Nash Cournot. And it's what we call a leader-follower model. So we bring timing in. Okay. So in a nutshell, that's what we're going to study for the remainder of the semester. And okay, I don't think that I left anything out. So I'll ask you guys really quickly, do you have any questions for me? No? Okay, so we'll take a 10-minute break. I'll be back at 8:40, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so welcome back. Can you all hear me? Diego, Derek?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Okay. So, okay. So this is our overview. There's one thing that we should point out first. So we're not doing a simple Cournot Nash equilibrium in the same way that maybe you're used to. And the important point, and this is a minor point, is that what we're talking about and what we're able to do with the skills that we have and the skills we're developing is we're allowed to, or we can now discuss what they call the difference between discrete and continuous, and the technical term in game theory, this is really an introduction to game theory, is action spaces. So it shouldn't be that big. And Diego, I'm still expecting you to be on chat because I gotta keep my whiteboard relatively empty to get all this stuff in here. But
All right.
thank you. So yeah, the difference between discrete and continuous action spaces. So I imagine that most people in this class have heard of game theory, but normally in economics, we'll talk about markets and we'll talk about individuals. But for most of the cases that we deal with, there's no what we call strategic interaction. And so what do I mean by strategic interaction? Well, and really you could talk about game theory and say that game theory is the study of strategic interaction. And so the metaphor of a game is appropriate, but what's the difference is in a non-strategic setting, it's like being a price taker, which means that and we start to talk about in terms of payoffs, right? And the payoff is contextual. If you're a consumer, an individual, you're still trying to maximize your utility, so you get a payoff in terms of utility from some scenario. And if you're a producer, you're trying to maximize profits. And so then the term payoff really is more appropriate, right? You get a payoff in terms of profits that you get usually from taking some action. So in a strategic situation, the payoff, one of the players, and sometimes they're just called agents, or individuals, but one of the players gets from their action depends not just on their choice, but also the choice of the other players in the game. And so again, if you think about a producer in a competitive situation, there's no strategic interaction at all if you're a price taker, because no matter what you do, you produce more, you produce less, you're not influencing the price. And that's the only place where you really meet your competitors is, in the market and the price. So you just produce based on your costs, and, presumably, right, unless, we define it otherwise, the costs that you face don't depend on anything your competitors do. You go into the labor market, you hire workers, you go into the capital market, you hire machines, and there are the prices there. And if those are all competitive, then, as a consumer, you're a price taker. When you're consuming the machines and workers, remember that in labor and capital markets, firms are on the demand side, so they're consumers in those markets. there's no strategic interaction there. And then when you produce the product and decide how much to sell based on your costs of production, you just sell, until you get the marginal cost of the last unit equals the price that's in the market prevailing. You're not interacting directly with competitors there. So there's just no way that what your competitors do in a perfectly competitive market matters to you at all. Does that make sense, Sonika?
Yes, it does.
It does. Okay, you're not going to disagree with me about anything. It's okay if you do. It's fine. I'm just explaining what the theory says. So maybe there's not
No,
a
it's
lot
just like my background on game theory is, since I'm an econ minor, I haven't taken so many classes. Like this is my third econ class or fourth econ class. So this is my second micro class. So the first one was the intro or principles of micro. So we didn't discuss too much on game theory. So
Okay.
I don't really have like a forming opinion on it yet.
Okay. Well, you said it was like your third or your fourth, but you know what I want you to say? I want you to say it's your best class econ so far. But anyway, yeah, and you know what? Actually, most people are in the same place that you are too, because unless they're like seniors or something like that, they might have had some more discussion of this in other classes. But this class is like a tools class, and so the way it's designed is that after you've taken just principles, you can take intermediate, micro, and macro, and those are kind of like the tools, and then all of the other field courses. So yeah, this is just an overview of game theory. We actually have a game theory course that Dr. Lange teaches, and I would recommend that one too. I think game theory is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I was thinking that would be one of my classes, because I had to take 2 more classes to get my minor, and I just didn't like do much on game theory as much as I would like to, because when I was taking the principles of micro class, COVID hit, so a lot of flustered. Yeah, that's when it was like the time we were all running back home, and so it was kind of hard to fully go through the class, and it was a huge transition, right? So yeah, I'll check into the game theory class though.
Yeah, tell them I sent you.
Okay.
So anyway, so the idea is, under competition, there's really no opportunity for firms to play games with one another. But as soon as we get into these environments where there are just a few players and they all have pricing power, then what price I charge affects directly how many customers you're going to have, because we're competing for the same pool of customers, because we're big players in the market. It's like AT&T and Sprint. A lot of times people talk about oligopoly, in telecommunications. It's a common example, or in, the oil industry, or in automobile manufacturing. Again, so what price Toyota charges directly affects the ability of Honda or other, direct competitors to charge for their mid-size car vehicle. So this is where we're having these strategic interactions. When firms have pricing power, it's because they're a big enough part of the market that they can influence the overall price that others in the market, other manufacturers, other producers in the markets face. So, but what you might already be familiar with, and again, sort of the most gentle introduction to these types of things, is the standard prisoner's dilemma game. And so I'm going to actually show a slideshow from my principles class, just to kind of jog your memory before we go any deeper in this. So let's see. I'll stop sharing this one and share there. Okay, so that's the beginning slide. I'm going to skip all the way down to and you can all see this, I imagine. I noticed I was on a Zoom call the other day, and when somebody was showing a slide, it was too small. So can you all see that well enough that you can read it, or should I blow it up? Diego, how are you doing? Can you see it?
I can see it.
Okay. So this is the classic prisoner's dilemma game. And this is, they call it a game matrix. It's just a table. And the actions, and you know, the language of game theory is kind of subtle, and I don't know. And I guess there's something in chat. Again, I don't know if it was important. Okay, good. And it's a little bit, you know, subtle, and you have to pay attention to it. But so you have a row player, and so like Clyde is the row player, and the actions available to Clyde are the labels on the rows, so he can confess or remain silent. This is about, I don't know if anybody's ever seen, there's some really good movies that have scenes like this where there are two co-conspirators in some crime, and they get pulled in for questioning, and they get put in separate rooms, and the idea is that confession is helping the prosecutors that are trying to prosecute the co-conspirators for the supposed crime or the crime they did commit. And if you do that, then normally they offer you a deal, right? You get a reduced sentence. But you know, not helping out the prosecutors, but remaining loyal to your co-conspirator is remaining silent, not saying anything, giving no evidence. And so obviously, if one person confesses, that's good for that person. But if the other person doesn't say anything, then the prosecutors go after them really hard with all the evidence they got from their co-conspirator. So the payoffs, and in this case, it would be payoffs in terms of utility, but it just depends upon your utility for going to prison for a certain number of years. So they're just labeling it with the sentence. So the way you would read this is, again, the actions available to Clyde are to confess or remain silent. That's on the rows. Bonnie's the column player, and her actions are confess or remain silent. Now, the subtlety in the language is a lot of times people would say that these are strategies, and you know, it depends upon the book that you read, but technically speaking, a strategy is a sequence of actions in response to other actions that you might face. Like it's like a whole plan or a whole menu. But a lot of times books don't do a good job of differentiating between the concepts of action and strategy, so that's fine. But technically speaking, a strategy is a whole profile of potential actions and potential situations. So you know, how do we analyze this problem? Well, again, notice that here there are two players. So if each player takes an action, the two actions define a payoff, and each of these different cells in the table corresponds to a different set of payoffs, one for each of the players. And you can see the way that we normally do this is we'll give the payoff to the column player, the one that's on top in the upper right hand corner, and the payoff that goes to the row players in the lower left hand corner. And here they're color coded, so it's really easy to see who's getting what. You know, Bonnie's blue and Clyde's the, I don't know what color that is, cream or white. labeled player. And so here, if they both confess, then they both get 8 years in prison. If Clyde confesses and Bonnie remains silent, she gets 20 years in prison. Clyde goes free for helping out the prosecution. And the payoffs are symmetric. So if Bonnie confesses and Clyde remains silent, Clyde gets 20 years, Bonnie goes free. And if they both remain silent, then Bonnie gets 1 year and Clyde gets 1 year. Now, the thing that also comes into play here is the notion of cooperation or a cooperative strategy. And so here, what we would say is it's a prisoner's dilemma, because notice that if they both remain silent, then for them as a group, right, the best outcome occurs, which is they each get 1 year in prison. And so the total number of years going to prison for the whole group is the lowest possible, right? It's just 2 years. If you add up all of the other options, like the remaining silent where one confesses, there's 20 years total done. And when confess is done, they're doing 16 years between the two of them. Now, actually, I want to tell you that so we talk about this cooperative strategy, and then we normally compare it to what happens in this non-cooperative strategy, where they both give evidence, which, if you again look at it, this is normally labeled as the worst possible outcome. And I want to tell you, even though this is a fine example, it's technically not a really great example, because usually what you see is that the case in which both players played the non-cooperative strategy, the outcome for the community, the group of them together, is the worst possible. So here you only see 16 years. Usually what happens in a classic prisoner's dilemma is this would be something like a total of like 30 years between the two of them. They both get like 15 or something like that. So this isn't a perfect example, but it's still good for purposes of simply illustrating cooperation versus non-cooperation. So, okay, the Nash equilibrium strategy, okay, well, so in Nash equilibrium, there's a dominant strategy, and the dominant strategy is to for each player to do what's best for themselves. And if they do that, then you end up in this result where they're worse off. Okay, so how does it work? Well, I was trying to look for the little slide that explains how to find the Nash equilibrium, but they're not really giving a good summary here. So I'll tell you guys, and then maybe we'll look for a summary slide in a minute. So what Nash says is that each player is going to, it's behavioral assumption, is they're going to choose to do what's best for themselves, holding the action of the other player constant. So if you're going to try to find Clyde's Nash equilibrium strategies, and then you put the two strategies together to get the Nash equilibrium, you'd say, okay, let's hold Bonnie's decision constant. Suppose Bonnie has chosen confess. So this is kind of like a theory of mind where Clyde is thinking to himself, okay, what should I do if Bonnie chooses confess? Well, then he's just going to compare his payoffs. If I confess, I get 8. If I remain silent, I get 20. So the best thing for me to do is to choose confess if she chooses confess. And then Clyde's going to say, okay, suppose Bonnie decides to remain silent. Well, in that case, I have a choice between choosing confess and doing no time in prison, or remaining silent and doing a year. Well, again, in both of these cases, whether she chooses to remain silent or she chooses to confess, going free is better than doing 1 year, and doing 8 years is better than doing 20. So Clyde has a clear action, confess, that gives him a better payoff in both situations, regardless of what Bonnie chooses. So that's his dominant strategy, because it has a higher payoff in every possible situation he could face. But again, I want to emphasize the way you find the Nash equilibrium action, the action that's best, is you hold the strategy of one player constant, and then look for which action has the highest payoff for the player whose action you're trying to determine. So if Bonnie chooses confess, 8's better than 20. If Bonnie chooses remain silent, Clyde goes free is better than Clyde does a year. And then you do the same thing for the other player, but since all of these payoffs are symmetric, but we'll just go ahead and go through it. Suppose Clyde chooses confess, Bonnie's got a choice between confess and remain silent. Confess dominates, has a better payoff than remain silent. If Clyde chooses remain silent, Bonnie chooses to go free rather than doing a year. So confess is the Nash equilibrium, and we end up here. From an economic point of view, and really our big concern is there's inefficiency because of the lack of cooperation. In a prisoner's dilemma, if these two players had decided to cooperate, then they both would have been better off. And that's what's interesting for economists. So I'm going to stop sharing really quickly, and I'll ask, does anybody have any questions about that? How are you doing this morning, Hannah?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
Pretty good. So do you have any questions about the prisoner's dilemma and that simple game matrix?
Not necessarily, no.
No, not necessarily. It's not a no. It's just like, yeah, I could, but I don't have to. Okay, and I'll ask. How about you, Emily? How are you doing this morning? Okay. What about Juan? How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing good, thank you.
Do you have any questions about the Nash equilibrium?
No, not right now.
Okay. So I'll open this up really quickly. It's a quick question. Do you guys notice anything that's kind of a little bit weird about the way that I characterize? Remember, what we care about most in economics is whether or not we end up with an inefficient outcome. And, I mean, really, and I told you guys this early on, economists only have two jobs, or two parts to their job. One is figuring out what the outcome is gonna be, which is, determining the equilibrium, usually, right? So finding out what's the price and quantity, what's, the characteristics of the resource distribution that's happening. The other job is to measure the efficiency of the outcome. Is there dead weight loss or not? That's it. So we care a lot about whether or not there's going to be inefficiency, and something is sort of odd about the prisoner's dilemma. Did anybody notice what it was? I'm opening this up. Okay.
Are you
Sonica.
talking about the prisoner's dilemma that we just went over?
Yeah.
I feel like the weirdest thing to me was the fact that when we think of like the best possible choice, we think that, oh, 1 year each is the best, not the 8 years. But like, if
Well, yeah,
we
you're right
map
about
both
that.
of them, yeah. So that was the one thing that I found was weird, that the 8 years each was the best possible choice, and like the way to get to it is just to map out which one are they both most likely to choose on their own accord.
Yes. So
Yeah.
so that is weird, but I'll want to follow up. Okay. So
Mhm.
so where they each do one is best from a group perspective, right?
Mhm.
But really where the prisoner's dilemma comes in is the idea that there's no mechanism for enforcing cooperation. So,
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the whole Bonnie and Clyde thing, the reason why they bring this up is because I don't know if you know anything about the story of Bonnie and Clyde, but they were
Yeah.
bank robbers.
Ride or dies.
Yeah, and they supposedly loved each other dearly, right?
Yeah.
So the whole idea is that, you know, when, you know, the cops are dragging them into the room for questioning, it's like, Bonnie, I love you, I got you. And then she's like, yeah, Clyde, you know, I'm not saying nothing. Right. But then they get in there and they realize, well, you know, is Bonnie going to just decide to go free? Is she going to roll over on me and tell the coppers everything that happened and blame me? And so then, right, it's not like they have a contract they can enforce in a court of law that, hey, listen, you promised you wouldn't say anything. I have a confidentiality agreement, you
Yeah.
know. So they're stuck having to try to guess whether or not the other one's just going to do what's best for them individually, or you know, they're going to respect that connection they have as, you know, I don't know, friends, and, you know, like, be loyal to each other.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
there's that they call it the tension between, you know, cooperation and self-interest. But the really interesting thing is, if you think about all of our other models, we don't have a lot, but I mean, the basic supply and demand is really big, right? In supply and demand under competition, all of the firms and all of the potential buyers, all of the customers, are just individually maximizing utility and maximizing profits. They're not cooperating. They're all acting in their self-interest. And that leads to an efficient outcome. But here, it's the opposite. It's that, you know, following your self-interest, in this case, you know, confessing, because that's going to minimize your time in prison, actually leads to an inefficient result when you
Yeah.
think of the two of them as being a community or like a society, right? So that's what's really interesting about the prisoner's dilemma and the Nash equilibrium from an economics perspective. Is normally we think that individuals maximizing their own utility, businesses maximizing their own profits as individuals, not cooperating with one another, gives us this great economic outcome. But in this situation of the prisoner's dilemma, individual self-interested behavior leads to an inefficient outcome. So, you know, where they would both be better off if they could just, you know, cooperate with one another. So that's why economists have spent so much time and are so fascinated. I do want to tell you one thing that's kind of a little bit of a saving grace as we apply the prisoner's dilemma to the supply decisions of businesses who are oligopolists. You know, they're a couple big players in a market. Remember, you have monopoly, which is just one seller, and then you have two sellers, which is a special, the simplest case of oligopoly. That's what we're going to study. And it's called duopoly. So you have just two. So if you have just two firms in the market, in our case, and I actually can show you guys really quickly, guys and girls, right? This is a case where there are supply decisions, and we can analyze it the same way. It's not really clear what's cooperative here, but I will kind of clue you in that selling less, right, drives up the price more. So when Jack and Jill, in this case, if they were to choose to sell the minimum amount, then you'll notice, again, if we do the same analysis, that as an industry, the two of them, right, they get $3,600 worth of profit. And if they sell more as an industry, it drives the price down. That affects their profit. So they only get $3,200 worth of profit here. So cooperation in the context of oligopoly means selling less and driving up the price more. Okay. And so we could analyze this simple example, which is, and we know it's going to be symmetric, but we'll just go through like we did before. If Jack chooses to sell 40, Jill can choose between 40 and 30. Well, at 40, she gets $1,600 profit. At 30, she gets $1,500 worth of profit. So she's going to choose to sell 40. Now, if Jack chooses to sell 30, Jill again can choose between 40 and 30. At 40, she gets $2,000 profit. If she sells 30, she gets $1,800. So again, there's this dominant strategy to produce more. And if we use this Nash gameplay, which is that each producer is going to choose to do what maximizes their profit, holding the decision of the other one constant, and we go through each of the scenarios, then we end up again in this non-cooperative, each doing whatever in their both interests leads to this non-cooperative outcome, where from the industry perspective, they end up with the smallest possible profit, right? So notice again, 1,600 plus 1,600 is 3,200. All the other outcomes, 2,000 plus 1,500 is 3,500. And if they were able to cooperate with one another and restrict output, they could get 1,800, 1,800, 3,600, right? So as an industry, they're better off if they can restrict output, behave like a monopolist, and drive up the price. And the other outcomes, remember, the worst possible outcome from an industry perspective is where they sell 40 and 40, they're increasing output, they're acting more like a competitive industry. That's worse for them. Their profits go down to 3,200. They're giving up, and from the producer side, right, the inefficiency is they're giving up $400 worth of profit here. And if they ended up in one of these other, situations where one was producing more than the other, they weren't acting symmetrically, there still would be more profit. So do you see what I'm saying, Sonika? That here they produce more, they act more competitive when they're in a prisoner's dilemma. Now the last point that I wanted to make, and hopefully this is clear, this is only dealing with producer surplus, right? What do we know about consumer surplus? Well, when more is produced and prices are lower, consumers are better off. So even though if we're considering as a community or as a society, only the players here, Jack and Jill, there's an inefficiency. But when we apply this to the decisions of producers, we know On the other side, there's also consumers in society. And so even though the prisoner's dilemma is inefficient from the perspective of the group represented making decisions here, the producers, it's not necessarily inefficient when we consider all of society and that the people playing the game are just the producers. We are going to find out, actually. And so I don't know, is that clear that there's another issue here? It's not just the producer's well-being, but the consumer's well-being, and there's tension there as the producers are less able to cooperate and lose benefit from behaving in a more competitive way. Even though they're reducing their own profits, they're actually helping consumers out. Does that make sense, Sonika?
Yeah.
Okay, because yeah, I mean, it's important to recognize both things. One is that sure, from the producer side, prisoners' dilemmas create inefficiency, but from a social perspective, that might be a good thing. And we are going to find out overall, even considering consumers and producers, that under oligopoly, when we had these kinds of situations, that it turns out that there is still a deadweight loss, there is still a welfare loss from a social perspective, considering both consumers and producers. And ironically, the problem is that under Nash equilibrium, under a prisoner's dilemma for production, that firms don't compete with each other strongly enough. They don't produce as much as they would under true competition. And so they're still making too much profit, even though they're making less profit than what they could make if they perfectly cooperated. Now, I want to make just a couple other points, and that is that, I don't know if I can get this to go here. What you'll see me say a lot, or hear me say a lot, is that perfect cooperation under Cournot is a monopoly, and in this context, we call it a monopoly cartel strategy. And the cartel, and a lot of times people get confused because they think, oh, are you talking about like drug cartel? No, listen, yes, we are talking about drug cartels, but the word cartel existed long before the drug cartels were around. So cartel is just a informal cooperative agreement between players in an industry that are producing something, whether it be drugs or oil, to behave like a monopolist. I say it's informal because it's not a contractual obligation, in the same way that the drug cartels, right, have to enforce their own contracts, right? They can't, the MicII cartel can, if they find somebody selling cocaine for less than what they think they should, they can't go sue that person for a contract violation and have the courts enforce it. They have to go out and, do it themselves. That's the problem with cartels, is that the agreements aren't legally enforceable. But the cartels' best profit outcome is to behave as a monopolist. Okay. And so just so we understand clearly, we could talk about ranking in terms of output, right, which is the quantity produced. And if we were to look there, we would say that the competition for an industry has the highest level of output, and then next is Cournot, oligopoly, and then the minimum amount of output is monopoly, cartel. And in terms of price, it's the opposite, right? The competition has the lowest price, and then the second lowest price would be Cournot. And I didn't put Stackelberg or anything else in here because this is just, again, just getting the lay of the land. So the last thing that I want to say, kind of in passing, is this difference between discrete and continuous action spaces. So are you still there, Sonika? I think you still have your mic
Yeah.
on. So
I'm still here.
Do you know when I say discrete what I mean versus continuous?
No.
Okay, so the word discrete in this context is like having whole numbers, right? Remember, like
yeah.
So like in the games, like Bonnie and Clyde, it was either remain silent or confess. You do this or that, right?
Yeah.
And in the case of the output problem we just looked at, it's either produce 30 or produce 40, right? There was no like I can do 30.3256. So it's the difference between whole numbers, which are discrete, and the real numbers, which are continuous.
Yeah.
And so really the modification, because the lecture that I just showed you is the exact same lecture slides that I use with my principal students. We explain the same concepts, and the only thing that you guys are going to do, well, you're going to do some extensions, but the main difference is that you're going to be working with functions. So you're going to be able to say, oh, well, if this firm is trying to maximize their profits and they're behaving in, a Nash equilibrium setting, then they're going to produce, 22.2 gallons of oil, and you're going to get, a specific price and whatnot for those kinds of things. So yeah, we have this more, general and realistic idea that the decisions that most people are going to make in the real world aren't going to be confined to just this or that. So okay, let's see. Okay, so before we get there, and actually I think I've laid a pretty good foundation, and what I want to talk about before we go any further is just to make sure that I covered it for you guys, because what I'm going to try to do, like I said, going forward, now that I've kind of laid this foundation, is to emphasize the problems that are on Ignithium, and then let you all, and some of it's going to be interwoven in the lectures that I posted, but let you all kind of digest those lectures outside of class, because again, if we're going to wrap things up, we're gonna need to make sure that you guys can solve the problems for our final assessment. So that's what I'm going to spend my time on. So from here on out, just note that the lectures will likely be a lot less explanation and a lot more just solving the problems. So if you all get confused about some of the language or things like that that I'm gonna say or use, just remember the reason why you're confused is because you haven't watched that one of the videos yet. Because I like I've done today, a lot of those videos include a lot of detailed explanation, which I'm gonna skip now. Not gonna do anymore. So, okay. So one of the things that I want to tell you guys, you all, is that to solve these sorts of problems, so the sort of like quick and dirty way to do it is to remember that when you have a linear demand curve, the marginal revenue always has exactly twice the slope. So I know that the marginal revenue
Professor?
here, yeah.
It's not showing the full screen.
Oh, okay. Hold on, wait a minute.
Yeah, it's only showing like the top with all the tabs.
Okay, hold on, wait a minute. Can you guys see the Ignition page now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you. So yeah, so if I see, for example, PB is equal to 154 minus 12 QB, I know automatically that the marginal revenue is 154 minus 24 QB. And then I set marginal revenue equals to marginal cost, and I can get the quantity of output for the monopolist. Is there anybody who doesn't understand that? Again, if you go through the lectures that I posted, I go ahead and show you how maximizing profit and getting marginal revenue. Why the formula is what it is. But with that, you should all be able to solve all the problems down to okay. Now you have the only difference here is that you have an equation for marginal cost instead of a constant, right? And so you guys should be able to solve all of the questions down to question 15. Now notice, once you get to question 15, things are a little bit different because you have these two marginal cost functions. And what you have to do first is you have to formulate the joint marginal cost function. So when we get together next time, and again, this is also the detailed explanation of how to formulate the joint marginal cost function is in those lectures that I posted. And you can just see the topics labeled and the stuff that I talked about today. We do monopoly, cartel stuff first, and Nash equilibrium, and then we get down to the leader follower stuff at the end. But once you hit question 15, and I'll tell you that on the final assessment, being able to correctly derive the joint marginal cost function is important. It's on the exam, so we'll spend a lot of time on Thursday just making sure we can solve these questions. But for questions 1 through 14, does anybody have any questions? I don't know if you all already started working on it and have it or understood. If I said, for example, right now, go ahead and work on question number 1. Is there anybody who'd be like, I don't know how to do that? Okay, because I'm asking. Okay, so make sure that you have 1 through 14 done. If you have any questions about that, then we'll talk about it on Thursday really quickly, and then we'll move on to the rest of these questions, which are 15 through 20. Okay.
I have a question.
Who's speaking, Hannah?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure.
We were talking about the competition last time. Are we going to have homework on that, or are we having homework on every single one of these sections, or are you just picking
Yeah,
like a couple?
Yes, you'll have homework on the cost curve section, right? And it's pretty short.
Mm-hmm.
And on Monopoly, we're skipping competition. You notice I don't have anything on competition. It just has linked to the math review.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that actually all the stuff up here, supply and demand, you guys have already done competition,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there is a little bit you'll see later. If I do the Monopoly one, if we get down this question number 5, okay, how much deadweight loss is created? Well, in order to answer that question, you have to find the competitive equilibrium with this information, because it's the difference between the competitive outcome and the monopoly outcome. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was watching the video actually on this question last night.
Oh, sweet. Okay, so you get it. Yeah. So that's the reason why, because I was like, oh, I'm not going to spend all this time doing competition when you guys have to do it anyway. You know what I mean?
So what other homework's already happened for the rest of the semester on the Ignitium?
Yeah. So normally what I hold students responsible for is to turn in is the cost curves, the monopoly, the Cartel, the Cournot, and then like these last 3 we normally don't get to.
Okay.
And the next assessment I give you is going to be cost curves, monopoly, cartels, and Cournot.
And is that going to be the final, or is that an assessment before the final?
Well, we'll see. It depends on how much time we have. If I have enough time, I'll give it as a final midterm, and I'll give you guys instructions. But I don't know if we're gonna have enough time, or if it's gonna have to be on the day of the final.
Are we in week 14?
I don't know. We have like 3 weeks left. You know. So this last, I mean, we're probably going to get you stuck at some point in time. This is probably going to be a barn burner. And then if I make it on the day of the final, you guys will have enough time to prepare for sure.
And is that going to be the normal 20 questions?
Yeah, that's normally about what it is.
Are we going to have longer than an hour and 15 minutes?
You mean because like the 2-hour time blocks for the final?
Okay, but yeah, I was just wondering if it's going to be.
Yeah, I think for the final, if we have more time, you know, if it's like an hour and 50 minutes or something like that, I don't have a problem with giving more time for the final. Yeah.
And then you would give extra time to turn it all in over that,
well,
right?
Yeah, I mean, basically, yeah, I would probably do that, give it a little bit more time. You know, technically speaking, there's a little bit of a problem, and that is that the way the final blocks are divided up, though I don't know if there's anybody who would be in this situation, but you'd have an hour and 50 minutes, and then there would be another class. They'd be starting their like in 10 minutes after that, there would be another class starting. So I might get kind of tied up. I might be able to give you guys like an hour and a half to submit your answers or something. But at some point in time, I would have to like say, okay, but then you only have another 20 minutes to submit through turn it in or something, because I can't. Now, if nobody has, you know, and we would have to like put out an announcement to the class or whatever. If nobody is going to be affected by having another final, right, where they can't, like if I said it, would you have an hour and 50 minutes and then you know, another half hour to turn it in turnitin.com, and then they say, oh well, I've got a final starting in the middle of that half hour period because I got another class behind this. It may not be an issue, but if it is, then I have to kind of, you know, adjust so that person's not adversely impacted by.
How would you adjust it per se?
What do you
we
mean?
start earlier?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, actually, we still have a final period for our first class, the morning class, and this one, though they're not usually staggered together. So, but what I mean by adjusting is that if somebody has another class after our final time, then I can't give you more time to submit and not give them. So I have to
Yeah, I
say,
understand.
we got to get the whole thing done in an hour, 50 minutes. You guys, you know, instead of having an hour 15 submit to Ignithium, you know, take an hour and 40 minutes if you want to, but you still have to get it done to turn it in by an hour and 50 minutes or something, because I can't deny the person who has another exam, you know, 20 minutes worth of time. But yeah, I'm willing to work to give everybody the most time that they can within reason.
Okay.
That's not a problem for me. By the way, I was going to save the last part of the class today, so I'm glad I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing and